He didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't even raise his voice, just sat in his wheelchair, weathered, silent and calm, trying to explain why he needed to use the service ramp. But the security guard wasn't listening. "You deaf or just stupid, old man?" Then a shove. His chair flew off the curb. Right into oncoming traffic. A city bus swerved. Tires screamed. People screamed. And 6 minutes later, the street was flooded with military vehicles, armed MPs, and a 4-star general whose voice carried thunder because someone had just laid hands on the wrong veteran. If you believe those who sacrifice their bodies for this country deserve ramps, not rage, type respect in the comments and keep watching. What happened next? No one was ready for. The city was already humming with morning energy when Mac rolled his chair out of his specially modified van. And let me tell you, that van represents more bureaucratic battles than most people fight in a lifetime just to get the modifications approved and paid for. October sunlight was doing that thing where it bounces off glass buildings and makes the whole world look deceptively optimistic, while traffic buzzed past in that familiar urban symphony of horns, engines, and the occasional siren in the distance. The Civic Center loomed ahead like some kind of fortress of polished bureaucracy, which, if you've ever tried to navigate government services while disabled, you know is exactly what it is. Mac had taken fortresses before, back when he was young, and had both his legs, and the kind of fearless stupidity that keeps you moving forward when everyone with sense is diving for cover. But those were different kinds of battles. This morning wasn't about heroism, wasn't about medals or honor or any of the things that civilians like to talk about when they want to feel better about sending other people's sons to war. This was about his prosthetics, the artificial legs that were supposed to give him some semblance of mobility, but had become instruments of daily torture as the sockets wore and rubbed and reminded him with every step that his body wasn't quite his own anymore. The VA paperwork had stalled, because of course it had. If you've ever dealt with the Veterans Administration, you know that hurry up and wait isn't just military doctrine. It's apparently their customer service philosophy too. But Mac had heard through the veteran grapevine, and yes, that's a real thing, more reliable than most news networks, that there'd be a mobile VA team at the Civic Center for one day only. One day. Miss it, and who knows when the next opportunity would come. So he did what he'd always done. He showed up. Clean press polo, army windbreaker that had seen better decades, but was still meticulously maintained, and that small 1st Cavalry Division pin on the left breast. No bigger than a thumbprint, worn not for attention, but as a quiet reminder to himself of who he used to be, who he still was. Despite what the mirror and the wheelchair tried to tell him some mornings, the plan was simple. Park, roll in, talk to the VA folks, get the paperwork moving, maybe finally get prosthetics that didn't feel like medieval torture. Devices, simple, except the accessible entrance was out of order, again, and if you think that's unusual, you've never spent a day in a wheelchair. Broken elevators, out-of-order ramps, accessible parking spots blocked by cars, whose owners figure 5 minutes won't hurt anybody. It's like the universe has a personal vendetta against anyone who dares to navigate the world on wheels instead of feet. So Mac did what he always did. He adapted. Rolled around the side of the building, past a maze of orange cones that seemed to exist purely to make life more complicated, around blocked curb ramps that probably violated 6 different federal laws, past a temporary delivery barricade that had clearly been temporary for about 6 months, until he found a side service ramp. Just one problem. Kyle. Kyle Daniels was 23 years old and had been on the job at the Civic Center for exactly 6 months. 6 months, which in Kyle's mind made him practically a seasoned veteran of security work. He wore his uniform like armor, paced his assigned area like he was guarding Fort Knox instead of a municipal building, and had developed that particular Swagger that comes from having just enough authority to ruin someone's day, but not enough sense to know when not to use it. The kid saw Mac coming from 50 yards away and immediately squared up, like Mac was rolling toward him in a tank instead of a wheelchair. Some people see a disabled veteran and think hero. Others see inspiration porn. Kyle saw an inconvenience, a deviation from the neat little world of rules and regulations that made him feel important. "Can't come through here," he barked, before Mac had even reached the yellow tape cordoning off the area. Mac stopped his chair with the kind of practiced precision that comes from decades of making do, looked up at Kyle with those clear blue eyes that had seen things Kyle couldn't imagine in his worst nightmares, and said in that calm, steady voice, "Just trying to get to the veterans event, son. Accessible entrance is blocked. This appears to be the only way up." Now, most people, most decent people, would have looked at Mac in that moment and seen exactly what he was. An elderly veteran, clearly disabled, asking politely for basic accommodation to access a public building for a legitimate purpose. They would have seen the carefully maintained dignity, the pressed clothes, the quiet patience of someone who had learned long ago that making a fuss rarely gets you what you need. Kyle saw a challenge to his authority. "Fire lane," he said, puffing out his chest. "Restricted access. Can't you read the signs?" Mac's hands remained steady on the wheels of his chair. Patient, calm. The same hands that had once carried wounded soldiers to safety, that had written letters to families of men who didn't make it home, that had signed dozens of forms to get the basic modifications he needed just to live independently. "Son," Mac said, and there was no condescension in his voice, just the kind of gentle firmness that good officers use when they're trying to avoid a problem. "I'm just asking for a little grace here. I'm not trying to park or set up camp. I just need to get through to reach the ramp. Main entrance is completely inaccessible right now." That word, son, hit Kyle like a match to gasoline. In his mind, it wasn't respect from an elder or the automatic courtesy of someone from a generation that was raised to be polite. It was disrespect, an assumption that he was young and stupid and powerless. "I'm not your son," Kyle snapped, and you could practically see his chest puffing up like a bantam rooster. "And you're not going through here. I don't care what your excuse is." He stepped closer, and Mac could smell the cheap cologne and the ego radiating off him like heat from asphalt. "Now, either turn around and find another way, or I'll help you turn around." Mac blinked slowly, the way he used to when incoming mortars were getting too close, and he needed to stay calm to keep his men alive. His voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen, didn't betray any of the frustration that had to be building inside him. "This ramp is the only accessible path within 2 blocks. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you're obligated to provide reasonable alternative access when the primary accessible entrance is out of service." And there it was, the ADA. 4 letters that represent decades of civil rights battles, thousands of advocates fighting for basic human dignity. The legal framework that was supposed to ensure that having a disability didn't mean being treated like a second-class citizen. To Kyle, it was just another rule being thrown in his face by someone he'd already decided was beneath him. "You people," Kyle said, and the way he said it made it clear that "you people" could mean disabled people, old people, veterans, or just anyone who dared to question his authority. "Always think you can throw laws around to get special treatment. You want access? There's the sidewalk. Figure it out." Mac's breath caught, not because he was surprised. He'd encountered this attitude before, more times than he cared to count, but because in that moment Kyle had revealed exactly who he was. Not just ignorant, not just young and foolish, but cruel, deliberately, consciously cruel. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Mac said, and for the first time there was steel beneath the calm. "I'm asking for equal access to a public building, to attend an event specifically designed for veterans. That's not special treatment, that's citizenship." Kyle leaned down, putting his face closer to Max, and whispered with the kind of venom that only comes from someone who has never had to fight for anything in their life. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to play war hero and get yourself crippled. The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, toxic, choking, impossible to take back. Max's hands tightened on the push rims of his chair. Not in anger exactly, but in that moment of absolute clarity that comes when someone shows you their true nature, and you realize that reason and respect and appeals to basic human decency aren't going to work. You need to step back, son, Max said quietly. But Kyle had passed the point of no return. He'd committed to this path, and his ego wouldn't let him back down now. Not in front of the small crowd that was starting to gather. Not when he felt like his authority was being questioned by someone in a wheelchair. Or what? Kyle said, louder now, playing to his audience. What are you going to do, old man? Run me over? And then, God help us all. He actually did it. He put both hands on Max. Shoulders and shoved, not a little push, not a warning. A real violent shove that sent Max's wheelchair flying backward off the 6-inch curb and directly into the path of oncoming traffic. Time slowed down, the way it does in those moments when everything goes wrong at once. Mac felt the sickening sensation of falling, not just the physical fall, but the emotional fall of realizing that this was how it might end. Not in battle, not surrounded by brothers in arms, but alone on a city street, pushed into traffic by a punk kid who couldn't be bothered to show basic human decency. The chair hit the asphalt and bucked like a wild horse. Mac's military training kicked in. Center of gravity gripped the armrests, don't let it tip forward. But physics is physics, and wheelchairs aren't designed for off-road adventures into busy intersections. The city bus driver, a man named Robert Washington, who'd been driving city routes for 15 years and had never had to make a decision like this, saw Mac careening into his path and had about 2 seconds to choose between hitting the brakes and hoping they worked, or swerving into the next lane and hoping nobody was there. He chose the brakes. The world exploded into sound, the shriek of air brakes, the screaming of tires against asphalt, the blare of car horns as traffic behind the bus locked up their own brakes to avoid a multi-car pile-up. The bus slewed sideways, passengers thrown forward in their seats, luggage flying, someone's coffee painting the interior windows brown. Mac's wheelchair came to a stop maybe 18 inches from the bus's front bumper, close enough that he could feel the heat from the engine, smell the burning rubber, see his own reflection in the chrome. For a moment that lasted forever, everything was perfectly still. Mac sat there, heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape, hands still gripping the armrest so tight his knuckles had gone white. Around him, the city held its breath. Then the shouting started. Jesus Christ, did you see that? Somebody call 911. That guard pushed him. I saw it. Is he hurt? Is he okay? A woman with a baby stroller. She'd been walking past when it happened, close enough that Mac's chair had nearly clipped her, was already on her phone, her voice shaking as she talked to the emergency dispatcher. Yes, a security guard at the Civic Center just pushed a man in a wheelchair into traffic. Into traffic. He could have been killed. Robert Washington, the bus driver, was already out of his seat, lumbering down the steps of his bus despite the fact that his own hands were shaking. "You all right, sir?" he called out as he hurried toward Mac. "That was too damn close. You hurt?" Mac tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat, tried again. I think I'm okay, just shaken. Thank you for stopping." "Don't thank me," Robert said, looking back at his bus like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. "Thank whoever maintains these brakes, and thank the good Lord there wasn't a car in the next lane when I had to choose." Several other people had stopped to help. A construction worker who'd jumped out of his truck, a woman in a business suit who'd dropped her briefcase to run over, an elderly man with a cane who was moving as fast as his own legs would carry him. They carefully helped Mac maneuver his wheelchair back onto the sidewalk, everyone talking at once, everyone asking if he was hurt, if he needed a hospital, if he wanted them to call someone. Kyle, meanwhile, stood frozen on the sidewalk, where he'd delivered the shove. The color had drained from his face, as the reality of what he'd done, what he'd almost done, finally penetrated his fog of ego and stupidity. He looked like he was about to be sick. A uniformed police officer who'd been patrolling nearby had seen the commotion and was already striding over, his expression grim as he took in the scene. The stopped bus, the crowd of concerned citizens, Mac in his wheelchair looking shaken but determined, and Kyle standing there like a deer in headlights. "Everybody okay here?" the officer asked, but his eyes were already fixed on Kyle. "Sir," he said to Mac, "can you tell me what happened?" Mac took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I was trying to access the Civic Center for a veterans event. The accessible entrance is out of order, so I asked this security guard if I could use the service ramp. He refused, and when I explained the ADA requirements, he became aggressive and ultimately pushed my wheelchair into traffic." The officer's eyebrows went up. "He pushed you into traffic?" "I saw it," called out the woman with the stroller. "I saw the whole thing." The man was just sitting there, being completely polite, and this guard just shoved him right off the curb. Other witnesses chimed in, corroborating the story, and the officer began taking statements while radioing for backup and an ambulance. Kyle finally seemed to find his voice, stammering excuses and explanations that satisfied no one, least of all himself. But Mac wasn't paying attention to Kyle anymore. While the chaos swirled around him, police radios crackling, witnesses giving statements, the bus driver trying to calm his shaken passengers, Mac reached into the side pocket of his wheelchair. Not for his wallet, not for identification, but for something that most people would dismiss as just another old man's forgotten business card. A small piece of laminated cardboard with a phone number and a simple logo, an eagle perched above crossed swords and an olive branch. Most people would have called their family, or their lawyer, or maybe just gone home and tried to forget the whole thing ever happened. Mac dialed the number on the card. It connected on the first ring, bypassing any automated menu, any hold music, any of the usual bureaucratic barriers that civilians have to navigate. "Ops Center, Agent Miller speaking. How may I assist you?" Mac kept his voice low and steady, even though his hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. "This is Sergeant John McGregor, U.S. Army, retired. Service number 345678901. I require immediate Level 3 intervention assistance." There was no hesitation on the other end of the line. "Understood, Sergeant McGregor. Please provide your location and the nature of the incident." "Civic Center, corner of Broad and Market Streets. I've been physically assaulted by uniformed Civic Center security personnel. I was pushed in my wheelchair into active city traffic and narrowly avoided collision with a city bus." The clicking of computer keys was audible even over the street noise. "Are you currently in a safe location, Sergeant? Do you require immediate medical attention?" "Safe, for the moment. Local police are on scene. I'm shaken, but don't believe I have any serious injuries. Ambulance is en route per standard procedure." "Understood. We are logging your report and escalating immediately. Level 3 intervention protocols are now active. Given your service record and the nature of this assault, particularly the endangerment aspect, I'm also flagging this for immediate review by the Veterans Affairs Protective Services liaison." Mac was a little taken aback by the speed and scope of the response. He'd expected maybe a strongly worded phone call to the Civic Center. Management, perhaps some assistance navigating the complaint process. This sounded like something much bigger. "I understand the gravity may seem excessive," Agent Miller continued, as if reading his thoughts. "But assault on a disabled veteran is a federal matter, Sergeant, particularly when it involves reckless endangerment at a public facility. Please, Remain on scene if you're able, and cooperate with local authorities. Our rapid response team should be making contact within 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Mac looked around at the still developing scene. Police taking statements, paramedics, checking him over despite his protests that he was fine. Kyle being questioned with increasing intensity by a detective who'd just arrived. 20 minutes seemed optimistic for any kind of bureaucratic response. He was wrong. It took 18 minutes. The first sign was a sound, a low, almost subliminal hum that grew gradually louder until it became recognizable as the synchronized drone of multiple heavy-duty engines. It was a sound that made certain people, veterans mostly, and cops who'd worked in areas with military installations, stop what they were doing and look around. Mac recognized it immediately. Military convoy. Heads turned up Market Street as 3 matte green Humvees appeared, moving in perfect formation through traffic that seemed to part before them like the Red Sea. Behind them came 2 black SUVs with government plates and the kind of discreet emergency lighting that said federal more clearly than any badge. They didn't need sirens. They didn't need to announce themselves. The vehicles themselves were announcement enough. The convoy pulled up to the Civic Center with the kind of precision that spoke of drivers who could navigate under fire. Doors opened simultaneously, and out stepped a dozen men and women in the crisp, no-nonsense uniforms of the U.S. Army Military Police. They moved like a machine, each person knowing exactly where to go and what to do. Within 30 seconds, they'd established a secure perimeter around the incident site, politely but firmly moving civilian onlookers back while maintaining clear sight lines to Mac, the bus, and Kyle. The local police officers looked stunned. This wasn't in their training manual. This wasn't in anybody's training manual. And then, from the lead SUV, stepped a figure who commanded instant respect from everyone present, civilian and military alike. General Marcus Thorne was not a large man, maybe 5'10", compact build, silver haircut, military short. But he carried himself with the kind of authority that fills a room, even when he's standing in the middle of a busy street. 4 stars gleamed on his uniform, marking him as one of the most senior officers in the United States Army. He was also, as it happened, a man who owed his life to Sergeant John McGregor. Thorne had been in town for a high-level briefing at the nearby Army depot when the Ops Center alert had reached his aid. Most generals wouldn't have responded personally to this kind of incident. That's what subordinates are for. But when he'd seen Mac's name on the report, when he'd been briefed on what had happened, he'd changed his plans immediately. Because some debts transcend rank and time and circumstance, the general's eyes swept the scene with practiced efficiency. The stopped bus, the crowd, the local police, the trembling security guard, and finally Mac, sitting in his wheelchair with the kind of quiet dignity that Thorne remembered from a firefight in the Balkans 20 years ago. Their eyes met across the chaos, and, for a moment, decades collapsed into nothing. Thorne approached slowly, his MPs falling into formation behind him, but maintaining a respectful distance. When he reached Mac's wheelchair, he stopped, came to attention, and rendered a slow, perfect salute. "Sergeant McGregor," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the street noise. "It's been too long." Mac, despite the shock and the exhaustion and the surreal nature of the entire situation, instinctively tried to return the salute from his seated position. "General Thorne, sir, this is unexpected." Unexpected, perhaps. Necessary, absolutely. Thorne's expression was calm, but there was steel underneath. "I received a report that you were encountering some difficulties. Unacceptable difficulties." He turned his gaze toward Kyle, who looked like he was about to faint. The young security guard was flanked by 2 MPs now, not under arrest, but clearly not free to leave either. "Is that the individual who assaulted you, Sergeant?" Mac nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. That's him." General Thorne walked over to Kyle with the measured pace of a man who had all the time in the world and the absolute authority to use it, however he saw fit. Kyle, to his credit, didn't try to run, though he looked like the thought had crossed his mind. "Son," the general began, his voice deceptively soft, "do you have any earthly idea who you just pushed into traffic?" Kyle opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "That," Thorne continued, gesturing toward Mac, "is Sergeant First Class John McGregor, Distinguished Service Cross for Valor in Vietnam, 2 Silver Stars, 3 Bronze Stars, 5 Purple Hearts, 32 years of service to this nation. He has bled on 3 continents defending the freedoms that you clearly take for granted." The general's voice began to rise, not in volume, but in intensity, each word carefully enunciated and delivered with the force of absolute conviction. "He is a man who has faced down enemy tanks, survived mortar attacks, and carried wounded soldiers to safety under fire. He lost his legs saving 3 of his men from a grenade blast. And you insignificant little wannabe dictator, thought it was appropriate to use physical force against him because he was trying to attend a veterans' resource fair." Kyle looked like he wanted to disappear into the pavement. "The issue of this facility's blatant ADA non-compliance will be addressed through appropriate channels," Thorne continued, now turning his attention to the Civic Center manager who had finally appeared, looking pale and terrified. "But the issue of assault on a decorated veteran requires a more direct response." He turned back to Kyle. "You will be taken into custody and charged with aggravated assault on a disabled person, reckless endangerment, and whatever other charges the district attorney, who I will be speaking with personally, deems appropriate." The MPs moved forward with professional efficiency. Kyle didn't resist. He couldn't have even if he'd wanted to. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings. As Kyle was led toward one of the Humvees, he finally found his voice. "Wait, you can't do this. I work for the city. This is police business." Thorne didn't even look at him. "You assaulted a veteran at a federal facility using federally funded security services. That makes it federal business. And when it's federal business involving one of my men, it becomes my business." The general then turned his attention to the Civic Center manager, who had been hovering nearby, wringing his hands and clearly trying to figure out how to minimize his facility's liability. "Mr. Henderson, I assume." "Yes, General. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. If we could just... I don't need explanations. I need answers. Why is your accessible entrance inoperative? Why is your alternate access blocked? Why is your staff untrained in basic ADA compliance and human decency?" Henderson stammered something about budget constraints and staffing issues and maintenance schedules, but Thorne cut him off with a gesture. "Your facility has just lost any federal funding. It was receiving. Your security contract is terminated. And you will have a comprehensive accessibility compliance plan on my desk by 0800 tomorrow, along with a formal written apology to Sergeant McGregor." He turned back to Mac. "Sergeant, I have a medical team standing by. They're going to check you over thoroughly. After that, you're coming with me. We're going to get you to that resource fair, and we're going to make sure you get everything you need, including a permanent solution to whatever bureaucratic barriers have been keeping you from getting proper care." Mac was overwhelmed. "Sir, this is too much. I just called because you were assaulted while trying to access services you earned through blood and sacrifice," Thorne interrupted. "It's not too much, Sergeant. It's not nearly enough. But it's a start." The next hour passed in a blur of medical examinations, official statements, and the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that only seems to exist when a 4-star general is personally overseeing the process. Mac was checked, rechecked, and cleared for travel. His wheelchair was examined for damage, none found, thankfully. Those things are built to last. Then, instead of heading home to his small apartment to try to forget the whole thing had happened, Mac found himself in the passenger seat of General Thorne's staff car, part of a convoy heading toward the Veterans Resource Fair. "You know," Mac said as they pulled away from the Civic Center, "I could have just taken the bus." Thorne smiled, the first genuine smile Mac had seen from him all day. "Sergeant, after what you went through today, I think you've had enough excitement with public transportation." At the resource fair, Mac was no longer just another veteran in the system. Word had already spread, discreetly through the tight networks that exist within the military community, about what had happened. He was met by VA representatives who had his files already pulled, his applications already expedited, his needs already assessed and approved. The new prosthetics that had been stuck in bureaucratic limbo for months, approved and fitted the same. O'Day, the housing assistance he'd been told would take weeks to process, fast-tracked with a beautiful accessible apartment in a veteran-oriented community already waiting for his signature. But more than that, more than the practical assistance, Mac was treated with the respect and dignity that had been in short supply for too long. Not as a burden on the system, not as a number in a file, but as a man who had served his country with honor and deserved to be honored in return. As the day wound down and Mac prepared to head to his new apartment, his new home, General Thorne pulled him aside. "You know this isn't charity, don't you?" he said. Mac looked up at him, puzzled. "What happened today?" Thorne continued. "The response, the resources, the attention. That's not because I feel sorry for you. That's because what happened to you was wrong, fundamentally unacceptably wrong, and when something like that happens to one of our own, we respond." Mac nodded slowly. "I understand, sir, and I'm grateful." "Don't be grateful," Thorne said. "Be proud. You handled yourself today with the same courage and dignity you showed in uniform. You did what you always do. You stood your ground, you did your duty, and you never gave up." He saluted once more. "It's been an honor serving with you again, Sergeant." The story didn't end there, of course. Stories like this never really end. They just spread out into the world like ripples on a pond. The incident at the Civic Center became a catalyst for change throughout the city. The mayor, faced with federal scrutiny and the very real possibility of losing millions in federal funding, launched a comprehensive review of accessibility at all municipal facilities. The broken doors got fixed. The blocked ramps got cleared. The training programs got implemented. Kyle Daniels faced serious legal consequences, not just for the assault, but for the civil rights violations that came with it. The security company that employed him lost not just the Civic Center contract, but several others, as city officials decided they couldn't afford to be associated with that kind of liability. More importantly, the video of the incident, captured by multiple bystanders and security cameras, became a powerful reminder of the often invisible struggles faced by disabled veterans. It sparked conversations in city council meetings, in VA offices, in American Legion posts across the country. But for Mac, the most important change was simpler and more personal. He moved into his new apartment on a Tuesday afternoon in November. It wasn't fancy, just a two-bedroom unit in a veteran-focused housing complex. But it was fully accessible, affordable, and surrounded by people who understood what service meant. He kept his old windbreaker, complete with the 1st Cavalry Division pin. He still wore it when he went out, not as a demand for special treatment, but as a quiet reminder of who he was and what he'd done. General Thorne visited once more before being reassigned to a new command. He brought with him a folded American flag, one that had flown over the Capitol, and presented it to Mac with all the ceremony such a gift deserved. "I'll be checking on you," he said as he prepared to leave. Mac smiled. "I'll be here, sir, not going anywhere." And he meant it. For the first time in years, Mac had a place that felt like home. Not just a building he lived in, but a community he belonged to, a place where his service was remembered and his sacrifices were honored. Sometimes justice doesn't come with sirens and headlines. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a phone. Call to the right number, answered by people who understand that some debts can never be fully repaid, but must always be honored. Sometimes it arrives in the form of military boots on pavement, walking towards someone who needs to be reminded that they're not alone, that they're not forgotten, that the brotherhood forged in service extends far beyond the end of active duty. And sometimes, just sometimes, it comes exactly when it's needed, most carried by people who understand that pushing one of their own into harm's way is a line that cannot be crossed without consequences. Because some lines, once crossed, demand more than just an apology. They demand a reckoning, and for those who wear the uniform, or once did, that reckoning is always just a phone call away. If this story moved you, if you believe that our veterans deserve more than just folded flags and empty thank yous, then do something about it. Type respect in the comments below. Share this story. Make sure people know that men like Mac still matter, that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off, and that dignity isn't negotiable. Subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell, because there are more stories like this out there. Stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, who came home changed, who deserve better than what they're getting. And remember, the next time you see someone pushing around a veteran, pushing around someone who sacrificed everything for freedoms the rest of us take for granted, you better hope they don't have General Thorne's number, because some phone calls change everything.